Mormon Mental Health Podcast is a production of the Open Stories Foundation and relies on donations from its listeners like you. To help keep this podcast alive, please consider becoming a monthly subscriber. Any amount will make a difference. You can click the right-hand donate button on mormonmentalhealth.org. All contributions are tax-deductible within the United States and go towards podcast production and building community support and program development for Mormons on various paths and journeys. Thank you for listening.
Hello, everybody. My name is Jeff Lundgren. I'm a therapist in Salt Lake City, Utah, and welcome to Mormon Mental Health Podcast. Today we have a set of panelists for a really important topic I think will be enjoyable for anyone listening. To lead in a little bit in terms of what this podcast needs to sustain itself is primarily donations. It takes a few $1,000s at a minimum just to support it and keep it running. So if you feel so inclined, you can make a donation directly from the website, which is mormonmentalhealth.org. Of course, not everybody can do that, which is perfectly okay. If you'd like to donate in non-financial ways, feel free to like our Facebook page, share any links that you might have, tell a friend, or reply with some comments on the website or on Facebook or other social media about this podcast or anything else. And of course, we're always open to recommendations of things that might be interesting to you. So today we're going to be discussing a difficult situation that showed up on a face-to-face fireside that was led by Elder Donald Rasband, who is a member of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And we're going to talk a little bit about depression and suicide. Actually, we're going to talk a lot about depression and suicide. So because we're talking about suicide, we want to encourage you, if you are struggling with ending your life or thinking about that, please call and get help or work with your therapist. The National Suicide Hotline is 800-273-8255, and you can also visit suicidepreventionlifeline.org, which has a list of fantastic resources that may be helpful for you. So let me start by introducing myself just briefly. I live in Salt Lake City. Like I said, I'm a clinical mental health counselor. I've got 5 kids ranging over 26 years, which is a story in and of itself. I work primarily with couples, but I work with people of all ages. I work with people that are struggling with faith, sexuality, their relationships, and life changes in general. Also with us today, we have Merri-Grace Allred, and she was raised in southern Idaho with a wonderful LDS family. She graduated from BYU-I and is currently pursuing a PhD in Immunology at the University of Iowa. She and her husband have been married for 9 years and have 2 amazing sons. Anything you want to add to that or correct me, Merri-Grace?
Nope, that sums it up.
Thank you. With us, we have AJ Jano. AJ is a gay convert to the church. He resigned in 2019 after having experienced depression, anxiety, and severe suicidal ideation. Anything you want to correct or add to that, AJ?
No, Jeff, thank you. Thank you for having me on.
You're very welcome. Thank you for participating. Also, we have Alessandra Jacobson. She is a wife, a mother, and a therapist. And some years ago, in seeing how important families were within the LDS Church, as we know, she decided to become a marriage and family therapist. And so, Alessandra, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much.
We also have 2 other clinicians with us. We have Claire Mellithin, and she is a licensed clinical social worker. She's a registered play therapist supervisor. She's an international speaker and author of Attachment-Centered Play Therapy, Proven Strategies for Child Disorders, and My Many Colors of Me workbook. She is a media expert on children and family issues. Claire, thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me on.
You're welcome. And lastly, we have Michael Benjamin. Michael is a licensed independent clinical social worker, and he graduated from Brigham Young University with a master's in social work in 2002. Since then, Michael has been providing therapy primarily for children, adolescents, and their families. Michael, thank you.
Yeah, thank you for having me. And
especially for providing a space for this discussion.
You're welcome. I appreciate all of you in joining. So this topic emerged from, like I said, from this broadcast that was specifically put together for young adults in the church. And I think more than young adults watched it, which is great, to provide answers to a lot of questions that we'll say millennials have regarding the church. And this topic we're going to talk about emerged from a question that was provided in advance. And the question that was provided said, I have serious problems with the truth claims of the church, and I am seriously considering removing my name from the records of the church. Can you give me a reason why I should stay? So this is the question that kind of started this out. As a reply, Elder Rasband presented a case why one should not leave, including showcasing a young man who was in attendance and presented a video with him that was done in advance regarding his struggle with depression and suicide. And so when I watched this, among many things, as a mental health provider, I felt the approach was careless. I thought it was dangerous. And while I'm certain that the intent by both the church and Elder Rasband was well intended, we're here today to talk about this. And offer some suggestions as well. So I'm curious, who would like to start out and tell me some of your thoughts, or maybe something that came up for you?
I think one of the things that hit me right away was the lack of compassion that wasn't there when he was expressing this. Like, why should I stay? And my first thought was, that must be so difficult to be thinking, just give me one reason, please, one reason. And his response back to that just lacked caring.
Yeah, it was a bit dismissive.
So when I first heard the question, I thought, wow, that's a really good question that a lot of people must have on their minds. And, I think there are good answers to it. A lot of people find a lot of comfort in the church and stay for very good reasons. And he could have given some good reasons, but he was very dismissive of the question, which I think was a lost opportunity for him.
That makes sense. AJ, you were nodding your head.
Yeah, I totally agree. It felt dismissive. It totally didn't acknowledge any sort of emotion or struggle that somebody having a faith crisis or going through a faith crisis may experience. Elder Rasband immediately reframed the question, and it felt to me as if, it reminded me a little bit of a separate talk by Elder Bednar when he was asked about, homosexuals in the church, and Elder Bednar said there are no homosexuals in the church, there are no gay people in the church. It felt very similar to that. It felt very dismissive in that way, as if your question doesn't matter, I'm going to answer a different question that I'm going to present and completely not answer the question that you presented.
Right, which is what he said. Go ahead.
As if you couldn't be a full member if you had doubts like that.
Exactly.
Right, for sure.
And I would add to that, not only, was the question dismissed, but then the answer that was given was completely unrelated. And I think that's the biggest concern I had about how the question was answered, is just how the story of, and maybe I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but how the story of the young man was used to answer a very unrelated question.
Right, because then Elder Rasband proceeded to say, after he reframed the question into, well, why should you stay? Let's make that, why would you want to leave? And then he plays a video, which clearly was prepared in advance, music track, well-edited professional video, describing the story of this young man who had been struggling with depression.
And I think so often, when you are in a moment of faith crisis, and I say moment lightly because for a lot of humans, this is a season of their life, right? Where each time you have a new question, new idea, it may lead you down to that. And one of the most reassuring things you can find when you're in a moment of crisis is a moment of connection with somebody else. And I think for this young man, both the one who originally asked the question, why should I stay? That's also a plea of, do I matter? Do you see me? Do you know me? And do you care? And I think that, instead of directly saying that to somebody and responding with that love and empathy, it was missed. And I think with this other young man in the video that you're just talking about, Jeff, again, that's that yearning for a place, a home, a place for my heart where I can come and be and feel safe and feel protected. he, you know, in his story, he found that through the gospel and through his membership of, you know, in the LDS church. And that doesn't mean that every other single person in a similar circumstance is going to find the same thing, when in fact it may be the opposite. And I think that this is where, you know, when individuals are struggling with depression, when they are struggling with suicidal ideation, we can have lots of good intent in our ways that we're trying to help. And I think sometimes through using that good intent, we miss the human that's in front of us.
Right. And even though it was the address was to probably hundreds of thousands of church members, I don't think that somebody who may have been listening, struggling with these things, they probably felt that it was impersonal. So I thought the video was well done. The only part in the video I thought was, again, continuing kind of that dismissive, was the analogy of you know, he was an athlete, so pole vaulting, maybe I'm saying that correct, it was never my sport. He talked about the repeated failures associated with the sport. And I thought, wow, like, so somebody who struggles with their faith or struggles with depression, that it's a series of failure, like that doesn't normalize the experience. It puts the onus on the individual as to somehow where they are in their life, whether it's their thoughts or their behaviors, has produced the depression. And that felt uncomfortable for me. Anybody have a thought about that?
Yeah, absolutely. His exact words, actually, it was a journey of many failures. And that just seemed like it was focusing on the wrong thing. Like instead of focusing on, you know, overcoming and persevering and pushing forward, it was, you know, just to say it was a journey of many failures. It just felt it was turning the focus upside down, I think, and it was very harmful.
Yeah.
I think it was also leaving out many important factors. Like, I'm thinking, what did your family life look like? What's your relationship like with your mom and your dad? Because he's in high school pole vaulting. What's it like with your siblings? What's your friend group like? Because he talked about pole vaulting before joining the church and how he was depressed and started drinking and all of these things. And so I pole vaulted in high school, and the repetitive of doing it and failing, yes, you do end on failing at that. However, that doesn't drive someone to want to drink and do other things. And so his depression is not a result of pole vaulting and failing repeatedly, even if you did get the highest you've gotten and then still had to stop at some point. It's the result of something else. And so I thought it was unfortunate that it looked like the depression was coming from something that's so fun that he would want to keep doing it, even if he is going to fail eventually, instead of the real things that could be contributing to it.
Yeah, that's super insightful. Thank you.
You know, the part that I actually really liked in the video was, at one point he said, when he first went to church, that he sat down next to this elderly lady and she was just really kind to him. And he said that she reminded him of his grandmother. And so I kind of wonder if that's what was drawing him in, as he was looking for that sort of loving acceptance, you know. And I thought that was really sweet and beautiful. And I think it helped me understand what he may have been feeling. And
I wonder too, if he was in need of that human connection, was church the only place that he could have found that? And that kind of plays into a lot of things. Like one of the comments that was made, Elder Rasband made, I think it was him, he said, if you leave, or you need to stay because of Christ, because that's where you can find Christ. And I'm like, is Christ so powerless that he can't reach out to you if you question? Is he so, and can he not find you even if you're not a member? And can you not make a connection with somebody who is a grandma figure unless you find them in the pews of sacrament meeting? I was asking these questions.
Right.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
Nope, you go first.
Okay. I say that got me thinking there's a lot of healthy things within the church, but that's only a way to do it. It's not the way to do it. And so, yes, there is a lot of connection and people who remind us of people that we love. And there's a lot of healthy things, but the framing that they have where this is the only place that you could feel Christ or connection or love, instead of it just being somewhere like, you can find these things and this is a way you can find it, and we would love for you to be here, but this is the only way, is what's not helpful for our mental health.
I agree. You know, I feel like community is one thing that the church does and does well. You know, there's a lot of very caring, loving people in the church. There's certainly a place for that in people's lives. But for me, for example, you know, as you mentioned when you read my bio, Jeff, you know, I resigned in December of 2019, and I did that because for my mental health, you know, I'm still a believer. I still believe in the gospel. I still believe in Heavenly Father and Jesus Christ. But for my mental health as a gay man, it was leaving the church that actually brought me closer to Jesus. It was not, you know, I've been able to, my spirituality has been stronger since I actually had to walk away because of mental health issues, because the expectations in the church of what my life should be and ought to be was just not healthy for me. So it's the paradigm that Elder Rasband is offering is very narrow in terms of who can fall and fit into that paradigm. And I think for a lot of people who are struggling with faith crisis, like the individual asking the question, there's a lot of we don't all necessarily, you know, fit that. There's a reason why we're going through the crisis that we're going through. We don't all necessarily fit that narrow bucket that Elder Rasband is addressing. That narrow, not bucket, I should say, you know, sliver of demographics that Elder Rasband was actually addressing.
For sure.
And I think going with that, I think that, you know, for a long time in church culture, whether it was directly expressed, which sometimes it has been, versus that indirect messaging of, if you're experiencing depression, if you're experiencing anxiety, if you're experiencing doubt, this is actually on you. It means that you're not being faithful. You're not reading your scriptures enough. You're not praying enough. You're not going to the temple enough, which then translates to you are not enough. And I think, you know, I've been so grateful that there have been a few apostles and leaders in the church in recent years who have kind of spoken directly from the pulpit saying, mental health is different from faith. This, like, it impacts one another, yes, but your depression, feelings of suicidality, that has nothing to do with how much you love God and how much God loves you. That's a mental health disorder. And I think that when it kind of gets blended together, like the messaging in the face-to-face fireside is we lose that distinctiveness of, and it goes back to blaming the person for their issues. So if you're doubting, wow, that's too bad for you, because you should just not think about it and come join the church. Just stop doubting. Then you'll be fine. If you're feeling suicidal, well, you should go to sacrament meeting. Don't think about it. You'll be fine, right? Like, this is some of that indirect messaging that's coming from a place, again, I think, and I believe wholeheartedly, of good intent. And what happens, though, is that when you are subjected to like this dismissiveness and this sense of responsibility over things I can't control, what happens is it deepens depression, it deepens anxiety, it deepens feelings of suicidality, it deepens feelings of isolation and loneliness, all of which then are going to constitute to a significant mental health crisis as well as faith crisis, which is what I think, you know, ultimately all of, you know, that's what we're trying to avoid for people, and we're trying to help them navigate through these. But I think when and until the messaging can really significantly change verbatim and verbally through, you know, the higher up, you know, echelons of the church leadership, all the way down to the lay, you know, the lay people and the members, where we can stop blaming and we can open up dialogue and actually have a conversation and say, tell me more about this. How does this make you feel? What are you most afraid of? What things bring you the most peace? And actually, like, being present with another human, I think that, you know, this is where healing can and does happen. And until that can and does happen, we're going to continuously see these like chasms be built between and within members of the church, as well as between members and non-members of the church.
Thank you. And I don't, yeah, go ahead, Merri-Grace.
Well, I kind of felt like I should share a little bit of my story, but if you want a quick tie into add on to what she said?
Yeah,
So,
please.
okay, so I think this is sort of how my faith crisis happened. So my husband and I struggled for many, many years with fertility issues, and I had a lot of miscarriages. And as a woman in the church, that made me feel really broken and inadequate. And there's this culture in the church, this prosperity gospel, that if you try hard enough, that if you read your scriptures, if you're faithful enough, that you'll be rewarded and that good things will happen to you. And, you know, my husband and I, we struggled and it just never resolved. And it came to a head this year where we had another miscarriage, and then my grandfather died. And then I was in the middle of my comprehensive examinations for my immunology degree, and I was extraordinarily stressed and I was extraordinarily depressed, and I had a nervous breakdown and ended up in the hospital for about 5 days because I wanted to kill myself, because I just couldn't live up to it, and I just couldn't. I could never give enough in order to have the good things that I wanted happen to me. You know, I could never find the peace that I was promised. So, yeah.
Thank you for a vulnerable story. So, Michael, I'm curious for you, because I was kind of aware that you had thought about the extent, we're not talking just about depression, but we're talking about substance use, which came out in the video, that somehow all of those situations were trivialized. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think to piggyback off of what a couple people already said is, I think there's this notion that if you are suffering from depression and anxiety, it's because of a lack of faith, right? A lack of belief. And I think the context that's missing, in addition to what Alessandra already said, is, you know, there's a context missing of, is there a family history in this young man's life of depression? You know, are there life events that occurred, life experience that he went through that contributed to his emotional issues? Genetics, biology, there's so many other factors. And I think that's, to dismiss all of those, the context and the bigger picture trivializes mental health and substance use, and makes it, as many have said already, about a sole issue of faith and not believing. And so the remedy, and I think this is the concern I had also about the video, is that the remedy to those problems was to join the church and to have faith, right? And that suddenly, because you now have faith, then you have happiness and joy. And I think that's very simplistic and dangerous.
And it might be dangerous because the implied comment that wasn't made directly is, if you leave, you might kill yourself.
Exactly.
Right?
You'll be unhappy. You eventually suffer from depression and all these problems. And so you need to stay in order to be happy.
Yeah, well, I mean, I literally have had people in the last few months tell me that that my faith crisis was just my mental illness, you know, and they didn't validate it in that sense.
Yeah, that's very painful. And I think it feeds an overall cultural belief within the church that, you know, if you have a faith crisis, if you leave the church, it's because you are going to go out and do drugs, you are going to go out and do alcohol, that you are going to basically go out and fall into these sins that lead into depression and all that. So it felt like very much like it was equating the young man's struggle, whose story they portrayed in the video, that exactly if the person asking the question leaves and takes his name off the records, then he's going to go down that path of drugs and alcohol and then suicidality. And that's just not a good message overall, because it's the wrong, it's not true. People's lives aren't like that.
Yeah, it ignores the fact that there are billions of people on this planet that really are quite happy and really are quite functional and really are quite doing well in life.
Without any drugs and alcohol. There's entire cultures that don't even do alcohol.
Well, and I think that for a lot of people who are in a faith crisis and in that spot of considering leaving the church, one of the scariest parts is losing your tribe, right? And losing your community and feeling that again, it's like that attachment, right, of that place of safety and belonging. And unfortunately for a lot of people, that comes to pass, whether it's through their own like withdrawal from their, support system that they've had in the church because they need to have that separation, or from their choice of leaving the church, of having people who have been on their team and have been in their support system say, I can no longer be with you because we don't believe the same thing. Or my kids can't play with your kids now because you guys left the church and you're bad. And this is the messaging, like where there's kind of like this fear-based attachment that's built into community and belonging within the LDS church, of come be with us, come join us, come be part of us. And when you're there, it's safe, it's healthy, you're secure, you don't have to question things, like we got this, right? But if you leave, know that you're leaving everything else behind. And I think that for many people who leave the church, that grief and that loss and that despair that they experience is not due necessarily to leaving the religious tenets. It's leaving and losing their community and the people that they love because of that. And I think that, again, that goes into something like where until the culture and community of the church can shift and change and not be in such black and white paradigms and way of being with one another, unfortunately, this is a real part of your crisis of navigating and figuring out, will I be okay if I really am standing on my own 2 feet? And can I tolerate that? And can I tolerate losing these people who I love, even if my belief system has changed and shifted over the years into something where I'm not being authentically who I am if I stay?
So I have a really wonderful bishop. I like him really a lot, and he's had to sit through a lot of hours of me being very angry about the church and saying very angry things to him. And one time I was talking to him and he said, you're not the only one who has doubts. You're not the only one that doesn't believe many of the church's things, but they're here on our board and they're still going and we still love them. And I said, Bishop, who are they? Because I've never heard them speak up. I have never heard them give a talk. I've never heard them talk in class. Who are they?
That's a good point. And I thought it was interesting towards the end of the reply, Sister Rasband focused on the importance of staying in the church because not to do so would impact your family for generations. Talking about the tribal significance of, well, this is your community, this is your tribe, and don't break that. Because if you do, then it's your fault, and then you're going to be held accountable for that. I can't imagine somebody that's depressed that would help them.
That is so much weight to carry for one person, that their decision is going to affect generations. I can't imagine carrying that weight when being so depressed and suicidal.
And Jeff, I actually think it was Elder Rasband who said that, and he even said something to the effect of like, think about what your decision means and how it's going to impact future generations. I mean, that is heavy. That's a lot of pressure. And I think, again, feeds into this whole guilt and shame that's put upon members of the church when they are having a faith crisis or having doubts, is guilting them into staying, which I think is not a great reason to stay.
Right, or guilting them for taking their life. We've all worked, at least those of us who are clinicians, we've all worked with clients that have experienced some level of suicidal thought. And like, I would never, as a therapist, I would never say, this is going to really hurt your kids. You don't think they've thought about that? Of course they've thought about that. Do you think, at least within a Mormon experience, the theology of celestial marriage and families being bonded together, suicide affects that how? Of course they've thought about that. That's not, I don't want to minimize that, well, you haven't thought about this. I don't know. I'm kind of passionate about that one.
I think it just goes back to the fact that in this whole segment of the broadcast that leaving the church and suicide were so tightly woven together that it's hard to like figure out which part they were talking about because they almost used them synonymously.
And to give the church some credit in this, in their most recent handbook that they sent out to the leaders, there is actually a section on suicidality and suicide in general, where it states this is not the member's fault for having these thoughts or feelings or actions, and it's not our place to judge. I mean, this is like circumscribing that. And again, that's a brand new language coming out that hasn't been in the traditional dialogue around this, right? And so, as we know, especially in bureaucracy and any type of organization, which religion falls under that, change is slow to take and also to implement, but it is coming out little bit by little bit. And unfortunately, like in this, where it gets tangled up again is, you know, in moments like this, where this intersection and intersectionality like comes together and they're lumping it all together instead of separating out these issues of, you're asking this question here, let's address that. Okay, now let's talk about depression. Okay, let's talk about substance abuse. Okay, let's talk about what it means to leave the church and how can we best support you. Okay, right. And if the church could do this and to separate out and give a place for question, give a place for dialogue, give a place for compassion and love towards one another, which I think is always, again, that, you know, that old saying, you know, the pathway to hell is paved with good intentions. And I think, you know, because humans are humans, we're going to mess it up and make mistakes. But I think that, you know, really where we can use our voices for good is also to start separating out these dialogues. And I love that we're having the conversation today of really helping to show that these things, yes, they can intertwine together, and you can be experiencing all these things all at one time, and it's complex and it's messy, and one doesn't necessarily equate the other either.
Claire, I completely agree with what you just said. I think if we would have gone into the face-to-face event knowing that this was going to address mental health, you know, issues and how faith can be a comfort and a source of healing with mental health, and I think it would have been completely different, because I think there is a place for faith and spirituality in recovery from depression and anxiety and substance use. I don't think it's the only part. I think, you know, and I think that was another issue I had, is that there was never mention of any treatment resources, support, other things that are recommended for people who are suffering from depression and anxiety. But I think if we would have gone into this event knowing that that was the topic, it would have been very different. And so I love what you said about, you know, separating out these issues, because they are so different and unrelated.
You know, it's so unfortunate, because a few years ago, Jeffrey Holland gave such a good talk in conference about mental health. I don't know if you remember the talk, Like a Broken Vessel. And he very clearly talked about how it's a physical illness, and that, you know, you should get professional help and seek medications that help you. And he did such a good job of treating it with such compassion. And gosh, I just wish that that approach had been taken when talking about mental health.
Well, but here's the redirect, right? Like the conversation became about mental health, suicidality, and substance abuse, but the original question was about faith crisis and truth claims. It had absolutely nothing to do with any of this. It was a simple question of I'm having trouble believing what the church has to say. What can you tell me to help me stay? Because I'm thinking about leaving. And so all of this conversation, because the questioner may not be at all suicidal, may not even be depressed. You know, he may be feeling entirely different set of feelings because of where he might be at in his faith journey and his faith crisis. And so, you know, all of that, it just, that dismissiveness of the questioner and his question and the reframing of the question from the get-go, as I mentioned, it's like, we're not going to acknowledge you. We're not going to acknowledge what you may be thinking, you may be feeling, what you're actually asking, because it was an actually incredibly well worded question. We're not going to do that. Instead, we're going to answer this other question that has absolutely nothing to do with any of this. And then all of a sudden, we're talking about substance abuse, suicide, and then what that looks like for the next generations in your family. And it's like, it was just wrong on so many different levels, because if you weren't upset and depressed before you were asking that question, if you're the questioner, you might be after this answer, because you feel very neglected and very, very dismissed.
Did they know? Okay, I don't know how these broadcasts are planned, but are they aware of what the questions are before it gets filmed? Like, is it all completely like scripted and rehearsed?
Yeah, I don't know how much of it is done on the fly, but both Elder and Sister Rasband and the two hosts had iPads or tablets. So there was some kind of an agenda where they were able to read the questions and the answers were already prepared. And certainly the video was done. Now, the video may have been done for other reasons and was just incorporated within the broadcast.
Right.
I don't know. But it was
So I wonder if
pretty
it
well
was just I kind of wonder if they just were like, oh, we have this wonderful video we want to share, but we're not quite sure where we need to inject it. Okay, this sort of feels like it would fit here, so jam it in.
Right. And I kind of think, well, they probably did that, but I would imagine, and I don't know, but I think that the church goes to great lengths to screen for any kind of public broadcast, right? The correlation component, the attorneys, right? There's a lot of effort and money that's spent around making sure the message is consistent to protect those assets. But here we're talking about people. And I don't, like any mental health professional probably would have wanted to raise their hand and say, I don't know, I'm kind of feeling uncomfortable with this, but I don't know, maybe that was never done.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think it was very intentional because they had the young man there live afterwards and had him respond to the original questioner's issues with the truth claims and wanting to stay or not in the church. And so I think it was very intentional, which again, that concerns me because, like you said, Jeff, I would think it would have gone through some layers of checks and balances and seeing if this is appropriate or not. The types of details that were shared in the video about this young man's suicidality were inappropriate and were against any sort of guidelines that are out there for how we talk about suicide in public. There should have been some sort of content warning for the kinds of things that were being shared, because stories like that, very emotionally charged stories like that can be triggering for individuals who are struggling with their own mental health issues.
I'm glad that you used the word triggering, because I was just going to say that listening to him was a trigger for me. Here it is, somebody struggling, and then you already had this way you were going to answer the question, and you brought the person in and had that person answer the question like, hey, I've been in your place, do this, follow what I did, and you'll be happy again. And for me, when I was 17, I had a baby that I placed for adoption. And part of the feeling suicidal after I left had very much to do with the adoption and the way that I was led to believe that my son's life should look like, instead of trying to help me be the best mom. This is what's best for him. I was being told what was best for him. And so, I did through LDS Family Services then, and they had brought in a girl a little older than me, and she just talked about how happy she was in placing her son for adoption, how it was the best thing. But there wasn't like a single mom who was in the church brought in, and how she was glad that she kept her baby, or someone who decided other routes. So it was sort of like creating this narrative where I didn't really have a lot of options. And that's what that felt like for me was, and then the day I found out I was pregnant, my dad read an Ensign article about a girl who placed her son for adoption. So when my dad knew I had something to tell him, and he just immediately said, I think I won't get to see my first grandson. Oh, my first grandchild raised because it will be placed for adoption. If he hadn't read that article that day, that would have never been the response that he had. And so to hear that, I guess, yes, that was just very triggering for me to hear that, like, okay, we have this problem, and you find the one person who does it the way, sure there's more than one person, but you find someone who does it just the way you want them to and bring it in to give you hope, instead of broadening in this and saying, hey, there's other options that could be best or make you happy.
And that was my concern too, is that it felt very like propaganda, right? It felt like we're going to use this story as a way to, like you're saying, convince that this is the way to health and happiness. And I didn't appreciate how that story was used as propaganda.
Yeah, this really a challenging thing, because I also respect on some level that the church's motives are well intended to not just the membership to have members, right? This isn't about, well, the fireside was about addressing concerns so that people wouldn't leave. That was the format. But it's more, I know that they care about the individuals. I really know that they do this. But at the same time, the delivery didn't hit that mark for me. Any other thoughts? I want to spend some time as we kind of wrap up here in a few minutes, and we might spend a few minutes in doing this. Anybody having other thoughts? Because I want to go into like what kind of recommendations would we give, either from our own experiences or something else to those who listen, church leaders or others.
I guess one other thought I had, so I wrote an open letter to Elder Rasband expressing my concerns about the face-to-face. And I've gotten a lot of different feedback from that letter. And one of the comments I received is, well, apostles are there to provide spiritual guidance. They're there to offer faith and hope, and that's their role. Their role isn't to offer, temporal guidance. And that was in response to the concern I had about, there not being any sort of mention of the importance of therapy and medications and other, treatment recommendations and support along the line, included within the context of the story and the response. And I just thought that is true. Apostles, prophets and apostles' roles are to provide that spiritual guidance for the church. At the same time, I think, historically, they do provide that temporal guidance as well. We think about, the spiritual guidance or spiritual principle of the second coming and preparing for the second coming. And the temporal piece of that is food storage and getting your finances in order. The spiritual principle of your body is a temple, and the temporal guidance that goes along with that, with the word of wisdom and, piercings and tattoos and things like that. And I think there is a place for our prophets and apostles to do the same thing with mental health, to say, that there are things within the church that can help with depression and anxiety and, prayer and scripture study and things like that. And there's also temporal guidance of seeking therapy and treatment and medications if necessary. So I thought that was, again, an important piece that was missed.
I think one way, I was thinking about your questions and how the church could help, but thinking one way is wanting to help the person make the best decision for them. And so as mental health therapists, that's what we do. We don't have an agenda when we're speaking with someone who is suicidal, who's depressed, who's anxious, whatever their problems are. We don't sit there and say, I know the answer before they even walk through the door. We want to speak with them about it and find out what works best. Whereas it seems there's kind of this agenda with the church where they already have the answers before they even know you. And so it's hard to actually listen to your struggles if it goes against what they're teaching you. And it would be helpful if they could see that. Like my parents converted to the church, and I think that was the best thing for our family because they came from some pretty dysfunctional backgrounds. They didn't have higher than high school educations. They wouldn't read parenting books. And I feel like the church really helped them to parent us in a way that we really needed. But my husband and I feel that would have harmed our children. And so it was best for us in raising our kids not to. And I can see where some people our age, it's helpful for them to be in the church. And I'm not going to hate on that. And that's great because that helps them. Unfortunately, it just isn't for us. And if they could make space for that, like, okay, maybe this isn't for you. It's okay if they want to hope we'll come back, but just making that space of, okay, maybe this is better for you right now, at least, and just kind of making room for that.
And then that additional spot of, and you still matter and you still belong and you're still part of our tribe. I think if that's where there could be that community-based love and outreach happening, not just as like, join our church, look how, come on, come be part of us, but that reciprocal nature of it's okay if you don't want to be, and I'm still here for you too. Right. And I see that much more on an individual level, especially like in the community that I live in. I've been so grateful for in my personal life, as well as, in our community and in our neighborhood. And I think that, one of the things I think that could be so helpful is just really understanding the different roles that faith, that clergy, that professionals, the educators all these different things work in conjunction with one another, as well as in very specific ways differently from one another. And giving these resources out freely and without needing to come seek them, in a sense, right? Like, because if you're already feeling depressed, if you're already feeling suicidal, going to your bishop to ask for resources may be one thing that's just too overwhelming. And if there was just, you know, a handout hanging out on the bulletin board of, hey, if you're feeling suicidal or depressed, here's a resource that's just normal, natural, easily accessible language, I think that that could make a big difference, as well as just the overall communication coming from the church leadership. And, you know, Alessandra, I love what you said of also being able to recognize the individual within the process, because I think that that's what gets missed. And I think for somebody in a faith crisis, that's where they feel missed. And that, again, going back to that original question of the young man, why should I stay? Because what he's really looking for is, do I matter? And I think that each of us, you know, our core human need is to know and understand, am I loved and am I lovable? And we need this in a physical sense. We need this in a literal sense. We need this in a spiritual sense. And when that core self-worth is questioned by the individual, or they feel that their worth is being questioned by the organization, that's where damage happens. And I think that until they can change, until we can change the language around this, you know, I think that the struggle, unfortunately, is going to continue to happen. But I think that, you know, for the listeners who are, you know, listening to this podcast, this is where it's so cool to have that empowerment to know that your voice actually really matters and your actions actually really matters. And how you give space to somebody else actually really matters. And you never know what a difference a kind word or a smile or a little note left on a doorstep or whatever, those little gestures, you have no idea how much they can be a life-saving experience for another human, you know, literally, as we're talking about some of these deeper issues. And I think that, you know, this is where those of us who, and all of us actually, who also can use our words to talk to the clergy members, to talk to the people who are in charge, where we have, you know, access and resources that we can, to also get some education around this. And I think that that part is so important, that we use our voices for good for this as well.
Wonderful, Claire. Thank you.
To build off of what Claire and Alessandra mentioned in terms of addressing the person, I think one of the things that we notice happens a lot with church leaders is I have to go back to it, is that redirection. And I think, you know, Sister Rasband, as part of the response, was talking about, you know, don't go to the anti-Mormon or anti-church materials that'll keep you stuck in rebellion. And those are very shaming words that totally dismiss the person in their faith struggle, because now you're not acknowledging the source of the issues that actually exist that realistically we all know, you know, like people, particularly leaders in the church, I'm sure they've heard enough about these things that they ought to know what's out there. And the church is putting out materials to address some of these, like the essays, the Joseph Smith papers. There's a lot out there. So it's not anti-church material that's actually, you know, shaking up people's faiths. And those need to be addressed, and they can be addressed. But wrapping somebody's faith crisis in, now you're in rebellion, you know, and anything that you're doing is anti-church, really, you know, it's again, if a person is beginning to question their worth, as Claire and Alessandra were saying, and they're beginning to, you know, not know where, if this is where they belong, and we want to provide them a sense of belonging, one of the first ways that you can do that is by legitimizing their concern and acknowledging what they're thinking and what they're feeling, and that perhaps there are issues, and perhaps there are issues that we don't have good answers for, but there could be ways of addressing these things, and there could be good reasons to still stay in the church beyond that, but you can't provide the good reasons without addressing the issues head on and acknowledging them, at least, because acknowledgement is an important part of you know, a sense of belonging.
Absolutely. Anyone else have any suggestions for church leaders, parents, anyone else perhaps?
You know, you got to listen to them, and you got to love them. And I'm just really grateful that I have family members and I'm in a ward where I have been loved and listened to. And it really does make a difference. You don't have to fix anything. You don't have to, it's just listen and love them.
Which is a Christ-like attitude.
Exactly. That's what Christ did his entire ministry. He listened to people and he loved them. Like,
Yeah.
I think one thing that the video probably was trying to do, I can only guess, is show some hope that can come. And I think that's important. I think it's important to share that. I also think it's also important to know where the lines are, as Claire was saying, between lay clergy and professionals, and knowing that lay clergy are not trained mental health professionals, and recognizing that and making sure that people are getting the treatment that they need if a person were to come to a bishop or a branch president. But also, I think having this discussion in this podcast is helping to contribute to the discussion and hopefully change and awareness to this issue that affects so many people.
Thank you. Well said.
I think too, for parents, stepping back, if you have a child who is depressed and suicidal, and thinking, being mindful, like, have I done anything that contributes to the way my child feels? Not blaming, because I don't put blame on anybody when it comes, but have I influenced them to feel depressed? Like, do I speak to them in a way that uplifts them, or do I speak to them in a way that makes them feel bad and like this is their fault? And just being aware that we all influence each other, and if there's small things you can change in your relationship, that might really help that person who's struggling.
And sometimes it takes a lot of vulnerability for a parent to say, hey, where in our relationship can I make a difference that would allow you to feel loved and accepted in the way that I love and accept you?
Exactly. Yeah.
Because sometimes that criticism is like, it cuts to the heart. And I want you to continue here. But as an institution, could the church do that? We don't have all the answers. We wish we did. Sometimes we're a little embarrassed we don't. Maybe we can find them together. What does that mean if we don't? Some of you might leave. We're okay with that. We'll still be there for you. That would be a vulnerable approach as well.
Exactly. Yes. Like, when I first left, my mom immediately asked, are you suicidal? Like, do you want to kill yourself? And my siblings were kind of upset she asked that. And I said, if you feel like someone's suicidal, the best thing to do is to talk to them about it. So I'm not upset with her that she asked. But later, when I actually was suicidal, and then it was like, well, she left the church a few months ago, so this must be why. And it's like, I so badly just wanted her to just say, like, is there anything I did that drove you to feel this way? And I would be like, thank you so much for wanting to listen. And yes, let's talk about it. But it's like, when you're depressed and suicidal, you can't open and be vulnerable with people who will not receive your vulnerability well. And when you already know what they're going to say and you don't want to hear it, you're not going to talk to them about it. And so for parents to think, like, how do I respond when my kids come to me with things I don't like to hear, or something I know won't make me happy, and realizing, like, okay, well, maybe when I say this, it doesn't come off well, and realizing how they can be a better listener to their kids.
And
So true, Alessandra. I'm sorry, Claire, go ahead.
Go AJ, go right ahead.
I was going to say, Alessandra, that's so true. As somebody who was very severely suicidal for many months, the expectation that anybody in that position should be the one kind of reaching out and engaging is just not realistic, because you are in such a dark place, and you really don't feel like you can turn anywhere. And so loved ones reaching out and engaging and asking and talking, like Alessandra, you were spot on in mentioning that.
And I think too, though, I want to just jump onto that, and to the parents who are listening. If your child is experiencing depression and suicidality, it does not mean that it's your fault. Right. And I think, and that's not like what I heard you say, but I just want to be clear that parents understand that. Like, can you play a role in helping to repair and heal? Absolutely. Is it sometimes out of your control? Absolutely. And this, I think, is where it's so important to keep your child first and foremost. And so if there's the battle going to church right now on top of everything else, guess what's more important? your little one right in front of you. That's the most important thing. And giving space around that needs to be the first and foremost priority for everybody. And I think, you know, one of the great things from the unfortunate epidemic we have of suicide and suicidality in our country is we also have a lot of great resources available. And there's some fabulous apps that are available for your smartphone. For those of you who are listening and struggling with this, a great app is called My3, so MY, the number 3. And that is such a great way to kind of just keep a little light on, first and foremost. And it's simple, it's easy to use. You can put pictures of the things that you can use to keep hanging on to life when you're questioning it, right at the tips of your fingers, literally. And another really great resource, especially for LGBTQIA youngsters as well as adult members and non-members of the church, is the Trevor Project and Trevor Space. And that is a suicide helpline and resource specifically for the LGBTQIA community. And I think that especially for members of the church, we know that the risk of suicide is extremely high if you fall within that community as well, and you're trying to navigate your faith versus your sexuality versus a sense of belonging versus sense of worth. Like, all of these complex things are kind of smacking you in the face every time you look in the mirror. And so that can be a really great resource as well for families who are struggling and for individuals who are struggling. And I think that, you know, just my last thoughts as we're wrapping on things, I think what I tell people is trust your gut. If you feel like something isn't right, or if you feel like something's off with somebody you love, you're probably right. And don't be afraid to ask them. That's different than blaming them of like, oh, if you would just read your scriptures, this would be so much better. If you just go back to church, you wouldn't have to feel this way. That's not the same thing as saying, hey, Jeff, I feel worried about you. Is everything okay? Can I do something for you? And if I can't do anything, I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. And just these messages and this outreach that we can give to others, I think is so important. And like AJ had said earlier, expecting somebody who is struggling to connect with you probably isn't going to happen, especially if there's not a strong, secure relationship in place. And even when there is, sometimes it's just too big and too hard and too much. And I think that that's where, you know, it's up to us to make sure our loved ones know that they're loved and really wrapping our arms around them regardless of where they're at.
Thank you.
The other suggestion I had, and this comes from so many responses I've had from my letter that I sent to Elder Rasband, is so many people who are saying, you know, I suffer from depression, or my son attempted suicide when he came home early from his mission, just like story upon story, you know, privately and also publicly that people are sharing. And so I've been impacted. I mean, I know this intellectually, but to see the people's stories, I've been impacted by how, you know, widespread, and I don't want to say normal, but just how it's so prevalent, right, among members of the church. That's something that we all experience. And if we could create and so this is my suggestion, if we could create a better space for having those discussions and dialogues, and move away from the idea that, you know, depression and suicidality and substance use and anxiety are due to a lack of faith or an inability to feel the Spirit, that I think there are so many people that are dealing with this in some form or another, that if as a church, and going back to that community piece, if as a church we could create a space to hold that for people and create even more comfort and healing within that community, I think it's there. I just think that so many people feel, as we've talked already today about, you know, they feel that there's something wrong with them, or it's because I don't have enough faith, or I must be doing something wrong, or I must be, you know, sinning in some way that's causing this. And so I'm not going to talk about that, right? And so, but if we can change the paradigm and change the narrative so that people can more openly talk about it, I think that would be so much, just a healthier environment for our members.
Merri-Grace, any final thoughts?
I'll just stick with the love them and listen to them.
AJ.
I think a lot was said here today, and I think this was a very important conversation to have. And I hope church leaders at every level really take the time to listen to this conversation and others, and maybe think about new ways of approaching situations, difficult as they may be, but that they need to be addressed, because we're talking about people and people's lives, behind these situations. So
AJ, Alessandra, Merri-Grace, Claire, Michael, thank you. I am super appreciative of your time, which I know is precious for you and your families. Thank you for participating in our panel today.
Thanks for letting me be a part of it.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us today on Mormon Mental Health Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please help us and become a monthly subscriber at mormonmentalhealth.org. The goals of this podcast include education, advocacy, and the mental health and general well-being of Mormons and their families. We can't further this work without your support. Music for this episode was provided by the Lower Lights.
Over life's tempestuous sea, chart and compass came from thee. Jesus, Savior, pilot me. Unknown ways before me roll, hiding rock and treacherous show. Chart and compass came from thee. Jesus, Savior, pilot me.
As a mother stills her child, thou canst hush the ocean wild, wondrous sovereign of the sea. Jesus, Savior, pilot me.
Boisterous wave, obey thy will. When thou sayest to them, be still. Wondrous sovereign of the sea. Jesus, Savior, pilot me. When at last I near the shore, and the fearful breakers roar, may I hear thee say to me, fear not, I will pilot thee. Twixt me and the peaceful rest, then while leaning on my breast, may I hear thee say to me, fear not, I